So let me introduce our speaker, and that's really great today. And I'm thrilled that you're all here. Alon Burstein is visiting assistant professor and Israel Institute fellow in the Department of Political Science. His research focuses on why groups use different types of violence in different conflicts, with a particular specialization in the Israeli-Palestinian arena. His work has been published in some of the leading journals on the topic, including Terrorism and Political Violence, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Israel Studies, and International Interactions. Recent projects from the past year have included exploring the international rise of white supremacy terrorism, the factors that influence which repression tactics states use in conflicts, and an analysis of how Israel's democratic backsliding would influence the Israeli-Palestinian arena. And so, without any further ado, I will hand the floor over to Alon Burstein, who's going to speak about the Hamas war, a 5-week update.
It's good to get, claps before. Great. Hello, everyone. So first of all, just a word about the microphone. There's actually no speakers here. This is for the recording, which is why I'm holding it here, even though you're not hearing any speakers. So if people cannot hear me, let me know. We're going to speak about the Israel-Hamas war that has been going on now for 5 weeks. There are a lot of contentious topics in the world. Few have been this contentious. Few have managed to bring up such emotions. And I guarantee that a lot of what I say, which is going to not be presenting my opinion on what's going on, but presenting a summary of the facts, is likely going to upset some people. Not because I aim to upset people, although I did tell Jeff in the past that my talent is I manage to annoy everyone, but more because we all feel something about this. And certainly the people that are here, you obviously care about the topic. So that said, there's a couple of things that I want to say. First of all, please feel free to write down any questions on the cards. Tell Jeff, give me all the questions, give me the hard questions. So that's okay. Okay, there's nothing that I will refuse to answer. As long as it's a question I can answer and not just a manifesto. So that's one. Two, terminology. Terminology is going to upset people. I'm using terminology. The terminology I'm going to use, there are words that a lot of people use in relation to this war. Anything from terrorism, freedom fighter, genocide, war crimes. A lot of people are using a lot of terminology, and people tend to get upset if you don't use the terminology they're expecting. Terminology I'm going to use is terminology that's grounded in academic definitions of why do I call it that. Okay, it's not meant to say it's good or bad, it's this or that, it's less, it's worse or better. Okay, that said, again, feel free to put into the questions. I'm happy to answer why don't I call it this or why do I call it that. And the last thing I'm going to say, this is all just for all the hype that has been the last couple of weeks. When there are questions, the questions are directed at me. I do not need help from people answering. That is something that's happened a lot in the past. When there's questions, all of a sudden, well, why this, why that? They're directed at me. I will answer them. I will also say the talk is being recorded and it is going to be online. So feel free to take pictures if you want, but it is also going to be online. So what am I going to cover? There are so many different arenas, aspects, avenues that relate to this war. I cannot cover them all. I'm going to try to cover as many as possible. I'm going to give an extremely brief intro, just to setting the stage. How did we get to the political conditions that existed when the war broke out on October 7th? It is going to be extremely brief. I'm going to try to do it in about 2 to 3 minutes, the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I am then going to talk about the attack on October 7th. I'm then going to talk about the retaliation into the Gaza Strip and Israel's invasion of the Gaza Strip. Then going to talk about the humanitarian situation and the humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. Then talk about what's going on in the West Bank. Then talk about the other arenas, the north of Israel, the south Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Iran, different actors that are involved. Finally, the speculations regarding the future of the Gaza Strip. As you can see from this list, I am not going to be able to give more than probably 3 to 4 minutes to each one of these things, which again is why we're going to leave a lot of time for questions. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Again, this is a topic that has been researched every which way. There are scores of debates about it. You could spend an entire time on it. UCI students, I am giving a course about it in the spring. So there will be an entire course about it. All I'm going to say here is try to situate who the actors are and what was the situation when the war broke out. The conflict started from an Israeli-Arab conflict, the first 30 years. And again, you can start the conflict from going back to prior to 1948. You can start it from going back however long you want to go back. But again, just for intents and purposes, the first 30 years of the conflict was the Israeli-Arab conflict, wars between Israel, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Morocco. This began to change, and the focus turned from the Israeli-Arab conflict to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict around the 1960s. Around the 1960s, after 1967, Israel occupies the other territories, but for now I'm just talking about what's relevant to us here. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip, alongside other territories that I can't get into now. Oh, I will add, sorry, I wanted to add before. If anyone is interested, these links are to longer talks on the different topics. So again, you'll find it online. There's a lot of information. Israel occupies the territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and they are held under occupation. They are not annexed to Israel, which is why they're often referred to, and technically, as the occupied Palestinian territories. Again, a lot can be said, but I will say that the two, arguably, most contentious issues, the issues that are the most painful for either side in the conflict since then, are the Israeli occupation and the settlement project, that is, Israel setting up settlements in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and Palestinians living under a relatively brutal occupation. And in turn, on the Israeli side, the fighting Palestinian organizations, specifically the two biggest ones, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, that was headed by Yasser Arafat, and the Islamic Resistance Movement, which is known as Hamas. Both of those groups were established, respectively, the PLO in 1964, but later in 1968, and then Hamas was established in 1988. They were designated terror organizations for their activities. The PLO is no longer designated a terror organization by most of the countries in the world. Hamas still is. They started carrying out a campaign of violence, which was the big thorn in Israel's side. Again, I'm butchering history here in order to get to what we need to get to. In the late 1980s, there was a process, a rebellion, called the First Intifada, that broke out in the Palestinian territories out of low-level violence. It lasted for 5 years against Israeli occupation. As part of this process, two things happened. One, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, began to change and officially embrace a two-state solution, officially embrace the idea of partitioning the land. Challenging this, the Islamic Resistance Movement, its acronym in Arabic spells out Hamas, was established and redefined the conflict. It challenged the PLO, saying the conflict is not a political conflict between Israel and a secular PLO. It is a conflict between Palestine and Israel, and also Muslims and Jews. And therefore, any such compromise over the territory is anathema. It cannot be. There was then the Oslo process, the second Intifada. Again, I really can't get into this now because I'm already over the time that I said I was going to talk about this. In 2005, after the second Intifada, Israel evacuates its settlements in the Gaza Strip. In 2006, Hamas wins the elections to the Legislative Council in the Palestinian Authority. And in 2007, there is a brief Palestinian civil war in which Hamas takes over the Gaza Strip, deposes any of the PLO activity, Fatah activity that was there. And in response to that, Israel, alongside with Egypt, imposes a siege of the Gaza Strip. Israel controls land, sea, and air, and Egypt controls the other land crossing in Rafah. That is where we get to leading up to where we are today. Since 2007, there's been scores of rounds of violence between primarily Hamas and Israel, with some activity in the West Bank as well. That takes us, again, that's the situation launching into October 7th. Throughout the 16 years since 2007 to 2023, there have been repeated rounds of violence between Hamas and Israel, each one of them ending in a ceasefire. And what appeared to a lot of actors in Israel was that Hamas was no longer interested necessarily in carrying on the conflict. It was just interested in governing the Gaza Strip. And there was a lot of different deals that Israel made to try to actually funnel money to Hamas and all kinds of things in order to let it govern. That illusion burst on October 7th. On October 7th, Hamas launched what is, by different accounts, the second largest or largest terror attack in history. On the morning of October 7th, at 6:30 in the morning, the group launches, within a few hours, close to 3,000 rockets and missiles into the Israeli territory. At that same time, it carries out one of the most elaborate attacks, again, as someone who studies terrorism comparatively in the world, that I've ever seen. Their force, known as the Nukhba force, which is the Hamas commandos, in several stages, break through Israel's impenetrable siege, impenetrable wall. The undefeatable IDF is completely caught off guard. Again, there's a lot can be said about how that happened. We're learning more and more. Essentially, they started from detonating 15 different locations along the fence that Israel has built between the Gaza Strip and Israel. They then sent things like, there's a picture of the tractor there, to burst through other areas, and they sent several different waves of attackers. Confidentially, I'll say the reason that they did not concentrate their forces in one place, but actually sent it across different places, is because they too expected the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, to be waiting for them. This is according to Hamas attackers that were caught. They expected the IDF, their intelligence knew about the plan, they're going to be waiting for them, and that's why they did it in several different waves, several different stages. Part of the invasion was invasion on land, invasion by air, famous paratroopers, invasion by sea. They took over 8 different IDF bases and outposts, carried out a lot of deaths and terrorism in those areas and kidnappings in those areas. I'm going to talk about all the numbers. Again, every slide's going to end with the numbers. And then proceeded towards different Israeli towns and kibbutzim that are in the areas surrounding the Gaza Strip. For several hours, they took over these towns, and mass atrocities occurred. There are reports of beheadings, there's reports of rape, there's a lot of misinformation, a lot of allegations. I'm not getting into all of the speculations on what did happen, didn't happen. I can tell you that as someone who talks about this a lot, I have forced myself to watch most of the videos that came out from the attack. I do not recommend anyone do that. It is not a pleasant thing to see. The fact is, there were scores of atrocities that happened then. The Israeli Defense Forces were caught completely off guard. The end result, by day's end, or actually by 2 days' end, took 2 days for Israel to actually manage to regain control of the territory. There are now confirmed close to 2,000 people who are killed, of them 351 soldiers and 843 civilians. There are also a good number still of unidentified bodies, because due to the level of mutilation, they are not identified yet. So this is just the numbers who are identified. And there were 244 people who were kidnapped back to the Gaza Strip. Those who were kidnapped range in ages. The youngest is viewed in the picture over there with the red hair, 10 months old. And the oldest were in their 80s. Since that kidnapping, 244 people were kidnapped. 5 of them have been released. 4 were released as part of deals that Hamas made and released them as humanitarian gestures. And 1 was rescued by the IDF. It took the IDF 2 or 3 days to regain control over the territory. And that is the attack that launched this. All right, one moment. I thought this would be a microphone that I wouldn't have to yell. I was wrong. That was the initial attack. Now moving on to the Gaza Strip. And again, every one of these things, I'm going to go from the beginning of the 5-week summary. So a lot of these things, and it's not like now in chronological order necessarily. In retaliation, the first thing that Israel started to do is impose an absolute siege of the Gaza Strip. What does that mean? I said the Gaza Strip was under siege already. It was under siege. However, as I'll talk about a little bit later, prior to this, humanitarian aid trucks flowed through every day. 10 to 20 to 30% of the Gaza Strip's water came from Israel. Electricity comes from Israel. Israel imposes an absolute siege, cuts off the electricity to the entire Gaza Strip, cuts off fuel supplies, cuts off water. So a full blockade. It then launches an absolutely unprecedented campaign of aerial bombings focusing primarily on the north of the Gaza Strip, but not only. And I'll talk next slide about how big or more how small the Gaza Strip is. When you say the north, the south, it's the distance from here to Los Angeles, not even. Launches an unprecedented aerial campaign. Again, all I look at here is just some numbers. Within the first week of bombing, Israel carried out 6,000 different air raids, dropping 4,000 tons of bombs. That equates to the amount of bombs that the United States dropped in Afghanistan in an entire year. Israel drops within the first week. So the campaign of bombing is unprecedented. At that same time, Israel begins to amass the largest army it has ever amassed. And again, I'm going to talk later about the humanitarian catastrophe, what's happening during. Now I'm just talking about the war itself, the war actions. Amasses the largest army it has ever amassed. Over 300,000 Israeli soldiers are called in for reserve duty, and Israel starts building up its plans for invading the Gaza Strip. The invasion doesn't happen until October 26th. During that time, between October 7th and October 26th, the aerial bombing campaign continues. So much so that by now it is reported that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the buildings in the Gaza Strip are destroyed. 25% of all agricultural territories in the Gaza Strip are destroyed. And I'm going to talk later about the internally displaced and the deaths, etc. But the bombing campaign continues. On October 26th, Israel starts its invasion. It starts its invasion without a big declaration. The invasion is starting, which is uncharacteristic in the Israeli case. Usually it says we're starting the invasion. The reasons that they did it that way, at least what are rumored, I'm happy to talk about later. It started its invasion slowly and then went in full force by October 31st. By now, we're on November 14th, Israel is in complete control on the ground. Again, like I said, before it was in control on air and seas, in complete control on the ground of the entire northern part of the Gaza Strip. And primarily Gaza City. That is the heart of where Israel is carrying out its attack. During this time, Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another group that carries out the attacks with Hamas, but smaller, continued to fire rockets and missiles into Israeli territory as well. So as the invasion is happening, there's still the continued retaliations going on from the side of Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The reports are an upward of 10,000 rockets that have been launched since the war began. Ultimately, again, I can talk about this for a long time, but I want to try to stick to somewhat of the 40 or 45 minutes that you've given me. Next time, give me a couple hours. Ultimately, the casualties. What's been reported so far, and I emphasize that, because it is very difficult to get information out of the Gaza Strip, among other things, for reasons of the humanitarian catastrophe that I'll talk about in a minute. What has been reported so far is 11,240 Palestinians that have been killed in the Gaza Strip. Of these, upwards of 4,600 are minors, 3,100 are women, and upwards of 27,500 are reported injured. In addition to this, there are reports of at least 2,000 to 3,000 people that are buried under the rubbles of the buildings that were destroyed. Presumably dead, but that's not part of the numbers now. Just for some context, the number of Israelis who were killed on October 7th and the number of Palestinians who have been killed since October 7th surpasses both intifadas combined on both sides. The first intifada and second intifada together lasted 10 years. Each one was about 5 years, depending on how we count. And more Israelis were killed on October 7th than in both those intifadas. In turn, not only were more Palestinians killed since October 7th than in Israel's retaliation during the intifadas, but over double the amount of Palestinians have been killed in the current war as if we take the last 16 years of escalations between Israel and Hamas. So it's unprecedented on any possible level. In addition to this, just another statistic of where it's unprecedented, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency, the agency that works specifically with Palestinians, is reporting by now 102 of its people have been killed, which makes this the deadliest conflict for UN workers in history. UN workers, again, appear in many conflicts, but the UN is reporting that this escalation now these 5 weeks has been the deadliest in its entire history. Moving on to the humanitarian catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. Just some statistics to give us some understanding. The Gaza Strip is a tiny place. It is roughly 365 square kilometers or 141 square miles. Its population is roughly 2.2 to 2.4 million Palestinians that are living there. It is one of the densest places in the world. I remind you of that when it relates to the amount of bombs that have been dropped. It's one of the most densest places in the world. The unemployment rate in the Gaza Strip is, give or take, prior to the attack, give or take 48%. Again, comparatively in the world, I'll say extremely high. And the Strip is under siege. Again, all this prior to the war, which means that there is some entrance of some goods and services. And if you have special permits, you can leave usually through Egypt. But in practice, it is not a thriving place to live. Prior to the war, upwards of 500 trucks of humanitarian aid, including food, water, medical supplies, and critically, diesel fuel, entered the Gaza Strip each day, usually through Israel. That was before the war. So like I said, first of all, when the war breaks out, Israel poses an absolute siege. So absolutely no humanitarian aid enters anymore. This will change in a minute, but that's what happened on October 7th. The siege includes electricity. The electric lines come from Israel. Fuel, which are used to run generators when electricity fails. And communications arrays. So the internet in the Gaza Strip has fallen by now 3 to 4 times. Israel has never stated that they're the ones that flipped the switch and knocked out the communications. However, that did happen every time, precipitating another Israeli invasion. But one of the reasons that I emphasize this is because the fall of communications is one of the things that make it very hard to know what's happening in the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Health Ministry yesterday said they can no longer report what's going on because they've lost contact with people in the Shiva hospital. On October 13th, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, put out an order through the United Nations and through Palestinian channels, calling on all Gazan civilians to evacuate down south, past the Wadi Aza area. Doesn't matter. If I had the map up, I would show it. Because the Hamas headquarters primarily are in the north. At first, not a lot of Gazans adhered to this, but as the bombings intensified, and as it became clear that Israel was going to carry out a full-scale invasion, more and more people started to adhere to this. To call people to evacuate from the north to the south of this territory is to call over 1.1 million people to evacuate down south during a time of bombing. That's a lot. That has vastly contributed to the humanitarian catastrophe that is happening. In addition, hospitals in the Gaza Strip that are dealing with a lot of injuries, right? They're dealing with a lot of injuries, are running out of fuel. fuel is used to operate the generators, which is needed for hospitals. Israel's come under a lot of pressure internationally to allow fuel in. Israel has been constantly beating that pressure off by saying there is fuel in the Gaza Strip. Hamas is stealing it, showing all kinds of recordings it intercepted that the administrators of the hospitals are telling Hamas operatives, give us back some of the fuel that you took, showing interrogations of different Hamas operatives that were caught saying, yes, Hamas has a lot of fuel barrels, etc. So it's a blame game between the sides. But the fact is, hospitals are being knocked out of commission one by one. Most of the hospitals in the north of the Gaza Strip have ceased to operate. In addition, hospitals are caught in the fire. They're caught in the fire both because they are in the midst of a very dense population and because Hamas has used a lot of the hospitals to hide. There is evidence that Hamas headquarters are in tunnels that are buried deep under the Shifa hospital. The Shifa hospital is the main hospital in the Gaza Strip, specifically in Gaza City. In addition, there's video footage that the IDF is constantly putting out showing Hamas operatives firing RPGs and anti-tank missiles from different hospitals. The result, again, just stating the facts, the results is that hospitals are also caught in the fire. They're caught in the middle. The Al-Ahli hospital is a particular example, hospital where a bombing went off at the entrance. Big blame game. Is it Israel? Is it Hamas? Was it a failed launch? Was it an Israeli bombing? Most intelligence services agreed that it was probably a failed launch of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Fact is, 200 to 500 people in the hospital died. All I'm trying to show is that hospitals are caught in the middle. The Al-Shifa hospital, which again is at the heart of Gaza City and where Hamas headquarters are located underneath, the Al-Shifa hospital is currently housing some 15,000 internally displaced people alongside all the wounded. And Israel is saying Hamas headquarters are down below. It is very unclear what's going to happen. Israel is now surrounding the hospital. It is very unclear what the plan is going to be. It's calling on the hospital administrators to evacuate. Different reports, they agree, they don't agree, they will evacuate, they won't evacuate. President Biden has said yesterday, 2 days ago, that he hopes that Israel does not carry out an invasion of the hospital, then put out a clarification saying it's of course Hamas's fault that they use the hospital and make it a legitimate target, but he still hopes the hospital is protected. Unclear what is going to happen. Starting on October 21st, Israel agreed to begin allowing again the entrance of humanitarian aid trucks, specifically food, water, and medical supplies. That said, for the first couple of weeks, the aid trucks were coming in about 20 to 30 a day. I remind you that prior to the war, when things were good in the Gaza Strip before the war, so to speak, there were 500 trucks a day coming in. So clearly 20 to 30 trucks a day, not doing anything, doing something. Because as the IDF has maintained these corridors, safe corridors for people to evacuate down south, and there's a lot of dispute if they actually are safe or not, but let's just say people have evacuated down south. There are currently in the south of the Gaza Strip upwards of 1.5 million internally displaced Palestinians. And so these aid trucks are coming in primarily from Rafah now into the south in order to offer some basic humanitarian aid. Israel has also been pressured to reactivate its water lines into the Gaza Strip. No fuel has been allowed in, and hospitals are crashing. It was reported in the last 3 days that several babies died in Shifa Hospital because the incubators failed. So the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is a catastrophe. Since October 21, a total of 1,096 trucks carrying food, water, and medical supplies have entered. And the last thing I'll say about the humanitarian situation, which again, happy to talk about later, is different deals have been struck on November 1st and November 9th to try to allow some Palestinians to leave the Gaza Strip. Specifically, the pressure that has been mounted on Egypt and Israel and Hamas are to allow Palestinians with dual citizenship to leave. So since November 9th, there has been a deal to allow Palestinians with dual citizenship to leave, and upwards of 1,000 Palestinians have managed to leave the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, in the West Bank. The Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, following October 7th, got very scared that possibly a similar style attack may be brewing in the West Bank. They since carried out a monumental crackdown, campaigns of arrests into different Palestinian cities. Since October 7th, total of 1,650 Palestinians have been arrested in the West Bank. Of these, 950 are supposedly members of Hamas. I say supposedly because that is the reports are put out by one side, the other side saying no, they're not. I'm reporting what I know. In addition, there are daily, prior to the war, between 100 and 200,000 Palestinians who have work permits in Israel, who go to work every day in Israel. All of those work permits have been revoked. Again, out of Israel's fear that actually this is going to be an entrance to another attack. So there are currently 100 to 200,000, again, the numbers vary, Palestinians, they're out of work in the West Bank. In addition, there's a question of the Palestinian Authority, which is its own question, who, what, where. Really don't have time to get into it, can get into it in question time. The Palestinian Authority is a nominal government, sort of, over a very small part of the West Bank. But the Palestinian Authority also is not functioning, among others, because Israel transfers a certain amount of money, a large amount of their budget. Each month, Palestinian Authority gets its budget from Israel as a result of deals from the Oslo times. Israel collects taxes and then transfers them to the Palestinian Authority. And there was a big dispute in Israel's cabinet. Should the money be transferred to the Palestinian Authority because they also pay the salaries, not only of different Palestinian prisoners who are in Israeli jails, but also of people in the Gaza Strip. So Israel decided that it is going to transfer over the funds to the Palestinian Authority, deducting the sum of the Gaza Strip. Palestinian Authority rejected this, and it is going bankrupt and cannot pay its employees. And there's currently, again, a blame game. On my way in, I saw a report that the chairman of the Palestinian Authority called on Israel to transfer all the funds right away. Israel answered, we will not pay funds to people who kill people, blah, 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 blah. Fact is, Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is also not functioning. In addition, since the war, there has been a substantial rise in violence in the West Bank, partially as a result of the IDF arrests. The IDF make arrests by going into the heart of Palestinian towns. Confrontations continuously erupt. Also, as a result of Palestinian attacks, and also as a result of a substantial increase in the attacks of Israeli settlers against Palestinians. Now, a whole lecture can be given on Israeli settlers and their backing from Israel's government. Yes, no. The facts are there's been a monumental rise in violence since October 7th in the West Bank. A total of 180 Palestinians have been killed. Of these, 172 in confrontations with the IDF and 8 in confrontations with settlers. This here is a leaflet that was left on Palestinian cars in the West Bank by settlers saying, flee your homes, we're coming to kill you tonight. The monumental rise in violence. In turn, also been a rise in violence from Palestinians. Specifically, 3 soldiers have been killed and over 10 were injured. But again, just to give some proportion, I said 180 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank. That accounts for 42% of the Palestinians that were killed in the West Bank this year. So there are always confrontations with the IDF. There's always low-level violence. There's always intercommunal violence. Since October 7th, the situation is getting much worse. There are continuous calls by Hamas to Palestinians in the West Bank to join in an uprising. In turn, Israel is carrying out its crackdowns all the time. Meanwhile, in the region, on the day the attack was launched, Hamas called upon all resistance actors in the region to declare war. on Israel. This was going to be the war to liberate Palestine. Specifically, Israel's big fear was with the entrance of Hezbollah, a group that is far stronger than Hamas, has between 120 and 140,000 missiles and rockets, has also very well-trained commando units in southern Lebanon and also in Syria. Iran was also involved and was threatening to activate Hezbollah and other militias that are loyal to it. In response, already starting October 8th, October 9th, the United States started to get involved. The United States stated that, first of all, it is issuing a warning. If anyone saw Biden speaking, don't. Issuing a warning to all actors, do not get involved in the war. The United States then sent 2 aircraft carriers to the region, which is with its full complement of aircrafts and associated ships. It then sent 2,000 Marines to the shores of Israel and issued a statement saying that if Iran gets involved in the war, it is going to be fighting US troops. It then sent 300 more Marines to different bases in the region. It then deployed anti-aircraft batteries in the region. And finally, last week, it sent in a US Ohio-class nuclear submarine to the region. All to say we are warning all actors, do not get involved, as far as the United States is concerned. In turn, different actors in the region, primarily now I'm talking about militias in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, stated that if the US does get involved in the war, and I don't know what involved means because they're sending troops there, but if they start fighting or I'm not sure what, then all these militias are going to attack US targets in the region, which is why the region is threatening to bubble over to at least a mini World War III. So what happened? On October 8th, Hezbollah started to very, very hesitantly participate in the war. I say hesitantly not because I'm disrespecting rockets that are fired, but because when a group like Hezbollah that has over 100,000 rockets and missiles, including missiles that can pack a punch and get all the way across Israel, and it only sends mortars to the area, that's a very hesitant participation. The participation has increased. Hezbollah has by now sent several hundred, I couldn't find the exact number because it's not fully reported by either side, several hundred to, I would argue, over 1,000 rockets, missiles, anti-tank missiles to areas in Israel, mostly the border towns and different Israeli outposts. In addition, Hamas mounted extensive pressure on Hezbollah to join the attack. It's important to note that in order to keep the attack secret, there's evidence that has shown that Hamas did not share the plans with anyone. Not Hezbollah. Iran knew something would happen at some point. Not with even the Hamas leadership abroad. Responding to this pressure, on November 3rd, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, who's shown here, meeting with Salah al-Aruri and leaders of Hamas and leaders of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, gave a speech. And that speech, a lot of people argued, was very disappointing for Hamas. Because he said, first of all, I'd like to hear everyone stop asking when is Hezbollah going to join the war. We joined the war. We joined the war on October 8th already, which is a very devastating blow to Hamas that is waiting for Hezbollah to throw its full weight into the war, saying we're already in the war. However, in addition, he issued many, many threats against Israel for its different actions in the Gaza Strip and against the United States, specifically referencing the aircraft carriers, and a lot of intelligence points to different weaponry that Hezbollah got from the Wagner group in Syria that can probably do some serious damage to those aircraft carriers. In the different confrontations, which again, every day are happening between Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon, which, like I said, involve Hezbollah firing mortars, rockets, and now extensively drones, and Israel carrying out retaliations with artilleries and with airplanes and with helicopters and all kinds of things like that. Thus far, reported 73 Hezbollah activists have been killed. 3 Hamas activists have been killed because Hamas also maintains a presence in Lebanon and has also been firing rockets and missiles from there. And 3 members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad have been killed. In addition, there are reports of roughly a dozen civilians that were killed in Lebanon. However, again, I say that reported because Israel maintains that they were Hezbollah operatives. There's evidence showing they probably weren't. There were kids there. But again, I'm going by what's reported. In terms of Hezbollah's activity, 6 IDF soldiers have been killed. 3 civilians in Israel have been killed. And 23 civilians and 16 soldiers have been injured. Lebanon. Moving on to Syria and Iraq. And again, each one of these things can be its own 20 to 30-minute talk. In Syria and Iraq, there are scores of militias that are loyal to Iran. There's also Hezbollah presence in Syria. There's also the Hezbollah Brigades, different group, in Iraq, which I will add and caveat is likely holding on to an Israeli hostage that they kidnapped back in March of 2023. Different story. However, the regions of Syria have started to also be involved in the war. On November 4th, Iran declared the Deir Azur area in Syria a closed military zone. Again, I'm not getting into the politics of why Iran can declare a place in Syria. Not getting into it now. A closed military zone and began moving several of its militias in Iraq to the area. From there, they have began also launching rockets, launching missiles, launching drones. A hell of a lot less than from Lebanon, but that is happening. What is also happening is different militias throughout Iran and Syria have been carrying out low-level attacks against U.S. bases. The United States still has bases in Syria, still has bases in Iraq. These have been attacked with mortar fires. They've been attacked with drones. The Pentagon has so far announced that, or I'll say by November 6th, the last time they announced, 46 different U.S. soldiers have been injured in these various different attacks. In turn, the retaliations. The Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, is retaliating against the different launching sites that are launching these different drones primarily, but also rockets in Syria. And the United States has carried out, so far reported, 3 different large-scale attacks against different militias and different locations of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. One of these happened 2 days ago. Reportedly, in response to that, different militias carried out a very, very impressive coordinated attack against different U.S. bases. So the area is constantly escalating. In these, what's reported, 16 Syrian soldiers, 3 Syrian civilians, including a reporter from Reuters, have been killed in these different retaliations. Yemen. In Yemen, there's a group called the Houthi rebels who are also to differing extents loyal to Iran. When the war broke out, they also said that they are going to get involved specifically if the United States gets involved in the war, then they will attack U.S. ships, but they're also going to get involved if Israel carries out an invasion of the Gaza Strip. In the end of October, a minister from the Houthi government tweeted one word, Eilat. That is the most southern city in Israel. 3 days later, the Houthis reportedly launched 9 missiles from Yemen towards Eilat. These were intercepted by Israel, the United States, and Saudi Arabia, which, again, we could talk about why and how Saudi Arabia is involved. I find the fact that Saudi Arabia is ending up intercepting missiles that are headed to Israel to be one of the twists of the Middle East. After Israel carried out the invasion, that same minister tweeted something else, and beyond Eilat. And since then, the Houthi rebels have began launching more and more advanced missiles, they're very armed, towards Israel. Most of these have been intercepted. One of them landed in Egyptian territory. And they've also stated that they are going to attack Israeli ships as they pass near the Gulf of Aden, and have threatened to attack U.S. ships. So that's the involvement there. Future of the Gaza Strip. So what's going to be in the Gaza Strip? Again, all the previous rounds have ended in a ceasefire that maintained the status quo. Maintained the status quo of Israel, siege, Hamas in charge. Everyone is saying that's not going to be the case anymore. Israel has stated that it is not going to accept a ceasefire or leave the Gaza Strip until Hamas is destroyed. Now, I get asked a lot because like I said, I also study Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but I also study terrorism. What does it mean to destroy a group? I don't know. I'm happy if someone wants to ask me that. I'll explain why I don't know. But it's complicated. The idea of destroying a group. Does that mean killing every single person who believes in something? Does that mean outlawing the name? What does that mean? There's a lot of different things that could mean. Israel is not going to leave until Hamas is destroyed. And then Israel has said an impressive amount of contradictory things about what is going to be the future of the Gaza Strip as far as it's concerned. Some have said in Israel that Israel does not want to govern the Gaza Strip, but that it will maintain a security presence there, to which the United States said, what does that mean? Prime Minister Netanyahu said that. They said Netanyahu should clarify. What does that mean? He hasn't. Other ministers in Israel, because Israel has an extremely right-wing government, have said that Israel is going to not only reoccupy the Gaza Strip, it is going to reestablish the Jewish settlements there that it evacuated in 2005. Others have put forth even more elaborate plans to deport all Palestinians. And others, primarily from Israel's opposition, but also some members of what's called the war cabinet, have said, no, what should happen is Israel should set up some sort of regional government or reinstate the Palestinian Authority to there that was deposed in 2007. What is clear, as far as Israel is concerned, is that they don't know. There is no plan. That's clear to me. Hamas has said that they are vowing to secure the release of all Palestinian prisoners. Again, they are currently holding 239 to 238. In Israel, they're reporting that one of them they have proof that may have died. Unclear how many hostages are being held. And that they plan to secure the release of all Palestinian prisoners. Palestinian prisoners, again, a complex concept, but there are upwards of 7,250 Palestinians that are held in Israeli jails. That is what that term refers to. I could talk about the complexities of it. The United States and the EU have both said they agree Hamas is going to be destroyed. But they both say the Palestinian Authority should be restored, which Prime Minister Netanyahu has said Israel will not allow. Palestinian Authority should be restored. The EU just put out a thing, a strengthened Palestinian Authority should be restored. Palestinian Authority has said it will not be restored. It will not retake control of the Gaza Strip unless this is part of a regional deal. If the Israeli forces and the government of Israel is willing to sign a deal with the Palestinian Authority to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, then they'll take control of the Gaza Strip. Otherwise, they're not interested in taking control and being, quote unquote, Israel's puppet. The Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Countries had a very unique joint summit in which they called for immediate ceasefires and reaffirmed that the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which is the organization that dominates Palestinian Authority, is the only legitimate Palestinian actor. Yet also, they did not say what should happen later. So what is the future of the Gaza Strip? Honestly, I don't think anyone has a plan at the present moment. With that, I'm going to give my voice a rest. This is my email.
So what the procedures if you wish to ask questions, as I said at the beginning, you're entitled to write down your questions. You can ask the hardest questions you want. Not a problem. It have to be done this way, and I think we now know why. So the way we're going to proceed is we're going to ask questions to Professor Burstein. He's going to answer them, and then we're going to get the time that we have. We have another half an hour left And I think it's going to be, I think we've seen that we can all learn a lot. That's the point. And so that's what we're going to do next. Thank you very much for your time. So, thank you very much for the questions. There's a lot of questions here. I'm not sure I'm going to get through all of them, but I promised to ask some of the hard ones for him. But I think given that he's just talked for over 45 minutes, I'm going to give him one that I think he's familiar with, right? And that it's something you didn't talk about. And that is, how does the Israeli domestic situation, right? Especially the troubles that Netanyahu has had with his own civil society and the continuous demonstrations on the streets of Tel Aviv and other places in the coastal plain and even Jerusalem, how does that feed into, how has Israeli public opinion evolved since October 7th? Does it remain as divided, or has there been some kind of rallying around the flag effect?
Free Palestine! You see is complicit in genocide!
You see is complicit in genocide. Free Palestine. Thank you very much. Maybe you see. Explains real.
I'm not going to assume those applause are for me. So the situation in Israel has never been more divided than in the last year. Some of my students in some of my classes are here, and I kept on telling them, if not for the war, what we would be talking about in the class on Israel would be the judicial overhaul. That was the big event that was going on. There have been unprecedented demonstrations. It's never been more divided. And importantly, part of the demonstrations, the allegations on both sides were that the protesters on the one side and the government on the other side is weakening the security system. That people are losing their faith in the country, are weakening the security system. Since the war broke out, there's been much more rallying around the flag, so to speak. There's a lot of unity in Israel, primarily because everyone is agreeing that now is not the time for divisiveness. Now is not the time for divides and to criticize one another. However, that is breaking specifically in the last 2 weeks. In the last 2 weeks, more and more organizations are calling upon the different protest groups to get up and say, Netanyahu's been in charge for the last 16 years. This is his fault. It's time for him to go. In turn, there's been more and more elements within the right that have been constantly saying, we need to be pointing out that the protests are the ones that weaken the country. So there was a rallying around the flag. It's not lasting.
So now so that was sort of my question, and now I'm going to turn to questions from the audience. And there are several questions that are along the following lines. Something like, why should Israel, right? This is a kind of a why should Israel question. Why should Israel allow humanitarian aid before all civilian hostages are released? Sorry. I'll hold it for you.
I tend to avoid why should, because those are policy questions, and that's a political matter. I will say that in general, according to the rules of war, you are not allowed to harm the civilians on another side in order to achieve your military gains, in order to achieve your military needs, according to the rules of war. Now, most countries do not adhere to the rules of war. So why should Israel? Shouldn't Israel? Again, policy question. But the fact is that the pressures as a result of, if you want to adhere to the rules of war, then you're required to not enact collective punishment, such as flipping a switch and cutting off all the electricity to the Gaza Strip, and such as denying humanitarian aid like food, water, and medical supplies from the population. The question of fuel is slightly different because Israel's made the case that fuel is what Hamas is using to operate the air conditioners in its tunnels and for rockets. So Israel's making the case that that is actually a military thing rather than a humanitarian hospital thing. Nonetheless, the hospitals are also running out of fuel. But that is the reason that the pressure is on Israel to conduct that. What should it do? Each has their own opinion.
I got it. I got one. Okay. So, it's part of getting old. You can see neither see nor far nor close. Since this is a big picture question, also from somebody in the audience, since 1948, Palestinians have been presented with the opportunity for a state several times. They declined these offers. What is your perspective on why Palestinians reject proposals for the two-state solution? And do you agree with the premise of the question?
Trying to answer that. Trying to answer that in a small way. No, I don't accept the premise of the question in its entirety. The Palestinians, as their own entity, were not offered a state in 1947. The rejection came from different Arab countries that were representing. There was no actual local Palestinian leadership with any authority that could have said yes. So it's not true that every time there's an opportunity. The closest the Palestinians ever came to achieving their own state, I would argue, is in September of the year 2000. September of the year 2000, the height of the Oslo Accords, there were negotiations between Israel and the PLO. And according to Dennis Ross, Bill Clinton, the people who were in the room, not just Israeli sources, the Palestinians walked away from that. Now, why? First of all, it's more complicated than that. There is, I'll add one caveat. It's difficult to talk about the Palestinians the same way as talk about why do the Americans think? Why do the Americans do? Right? There's different parties in the Palestinians. There's different sentiments. There's different ideas. So there is no one Palestinians who did that. The closest they ever came is in the year 2000. There's a lot of theories why. It's possible that Arafat thought that maybe he would achieve more. It's possible that he thought that his political career would be over. And I know this will shock everyone, but like everywhere else in the world, Palestinian politicians care about their careers too, not just about their people. So it's possible that that is the reason. I don't really know, but it's not, I would argue it's not true that there are so many opportunities that have been turned down. I think the one that can be said to have been turned down is then. There's a lot of explanations as to why, but again, that's gonna take an hour.
Good. This is a good question, which is kind of an educational opportunity. Can you speak to the nature of UNRWA, the United Nations, the refugee agency? Is it, in your view, a genuinely non-political international organization, or how does it compare with other similarly situated, if there are any similarly situated organizations? Because you talked about the deaths in UNRWA in the current war.
So UNRWA is relatively unique. When, after the war of 1948-49, which again, can be called the War of Independence, can be called Nakba, don't care. After the war of 1948-49, the UN sets up UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency. Palestinians are the only entity that have their own UN agency. All other refugees are dealt with the UNDP. And in turn, Palestinians have their own entity. As part of that, UNRWA came up with its own rules and definitions of what does it mean to be a refugee. And that is the reason that the definitions of Palestinian refugees are different than refugees elsewhere. For example, the refugees passed on from generation to generation does not exist for other refugees. Again, I'm not arguing right or wrong. I'm saying that is the history of UNRWA. Now, in terms of are they truly neutral or truly nonpartisan? No, but I'll add to that. No UN organization is. UN organizations work on the ground. In order to work on the ground, you have to work with the on-the-ground forces. The UN forces in Afghanistan have to form good relations with the Taliban. Otherwise, they will not be allowed to work there. So what ends up happening is a lot of employees of the UN agencies are people who are either Taliban affiliates or through some connections, and this ends up influencing the organization. Same goes with UNRWA. A lot of its employees are de facto. Most of its employees are de facto Palestinians. Some Palestinians support Hamas. Some Palestinians work for Hamas. Some Palestinians don't. But this is not, that into itself is not unique to the Palestinian case. The definitions of refugeehood and that they have their own agency is unique. And also, there's other complications to this, primarily the fact that the political status of the occupied Palestinian territories from between 49 to 67, when Gaza was under Egypt and the West Bank was under Jordan, then under Israeli direct occupation, then under the Palestinian Authority have changed so much that UNRWA has also changed and evolved, but not nearly fast enough. So a lot of its practices are still from these past decades. So that's the simplest answer I'm going to give. I'm not going to try to clarify.
Well, in the same educational mode, there's another good question which you started to hint at some of the answers to, but I'm sure you don't have. How do you explain the attack on October 7th in the kibbutz, which is usually the most heavily guarded as the borders of Gaza? And how do you explain the fact that it took the IDF 6 hours before they arrived in the area, especially since the border was breached at 15 different parts and the IDF was immediately informed? So, I mean, without getting into conspiracy theories, which I think are always very tempting, right? But I mean, this isn't a kind of an unusual gap. And what are the kind of factors that explain the gap?
This is going to be the subject of many dissertations, those students of you out there who are thinking, what am I going to write about in my dissertation? What happened? The IDF prides itself as being one of the most professional armies in the world. Israeli intelligence advises US intelligence, NATO intelligence. So what happened? There are a lot of theories. What has been shown to be true so far is, first of all, Hamas studied very well. They studied very well. They carried out monumental subterfuge going back. They've been planning this attack for over 2 years. Among that, they continuously fooled Israel into thinking that they're not interested in escalations. And one of the things that they did is in the last several rounds of escalations, it was specifically Israel versus the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And the jihad called on Hamas to also join, and Hamas did not. And this is one of the things that heavily convinced Israel that Hamas is not interested in escalations. 1. 2, they carried out their intelligence very, very cleverly. This is all why Israel didn't know, not why it took the IDF so long. They carried out their intelligence very, very intelligently. Forgive me for that one. Most of the Nukhba fighters, and there are reports of between 2,000 to 3,000 fighters that invaded Israel, did not know about the plan until 4 a.m. that morning. That is when they were told. They had been training, but a lot of groups train. They've been training for a long time, and the reports of those who were captured said they thought they were being woken up for a training. And then they were told, no, this is where you're going. So that is another reason for the intelligence, at least subterfuge. Now, how did they manage to actually breach through? Again, what is known is that they just planned it very, very well. At first, they sent out an army of drones that bombed Israel's cameras. Because again, they sent out people for many months to map out where Israel's cameras. So within an hour, all of Israel's cameras on the Gaza Strip were gone. They then stormed the different bases with prior intelligence knowing when guard towers switch. They then, after storming the bases, invaded different Israeli towns. And also that, they did, forgive me, very, very intelligently. They sent their first wave that went to the towns to not carry out any massacres or kidnappings. They sent them to go to a kibbutz, shoot at it, get on a motorbike. Go to another kibbutz, shoot at it, get on a motorbike. Go to another kibbutz, so that alarm bells were going off in every single town, in every single kibbutz. So the IDF did not know where to go either. Finally, I will add, Hamas didn't think they were going to succeed this well. They've openly said that. They expected the IDF to be waiting for them. This is a huge screw up. It's the nicest way I can say it. On the IDF's part, they did not expect to succeed. The reason they carried out several different waves and different locations is because they thought that the army would be waiting for them, and they hoped that 1 or 2 of their units would get by. This is shown in a lot of different things. One of the reasons people keep asking me, will there be a hostage deal? And I say probably, because Hamas has openly said they went to get rid of some of the hostages. They planned to kidnap, I'm guessing now, 50 people. They did not plan to succeed to kidnap. They did not plan to continuously to manage to kidnap so many people. They don't have the facilities to hold them even. So I don't know exactly how it happened. Like I said, it's going to be a dissertation, but it was very, very well planned out. And the monumental failure on Israeli Defense Forces side is also something. There's a lot of speculation, how and why. Good set of lungs. There's a lot of speculations on how and why. But again, it's all speculation at this point.
So I'm especially happy to ask this question because it's from a student in my class. And she told me she was going to ask this question, but it's a repeat of somebody else's question. And it has to do with the nature of the data that you cited. Would you not agree that there's a kind of imbalance in the accuracy of the data, of the body counts, right? For example, on the one hand, you're relying on kind of Israeli government organizations, which are continuously exposed to kind of, not that they don't make mistakes or even lie, but they're continually exposed to kind of being exposed, versus the Hamas Health Ministry, right? Which has its own different set of kind of lacks of capacity and kind of dictatorial pressures that are just completely different than in Israel. So, I mean, when you're issuing these numbers, and this is what's written here, you're issuing this kind of precise numbers, but can you actually speak to that with the kind of precision that you were talking about? That's a kind of a tough version of the question, which she wrote.
I get asked that a lot. Another question I get asked, so I'll just add it to that, is, but of those, how many are Hamas members? How many are Hamas attackers? How many are Hamas terrorists? Whatever you want to call it. So I'll say two things. One, yes, there is an imbalance of accuracy and rigorousness and bureaucracy and the ability between the IDF body count and the Hamas Ministry of Health. That said, I've been following this conflict now for way too many years. And I can tell you that Hamas Ministry of Health is usually pretty accurate when it comes to body counts. Often, not necessarily in the moment, but at the same time, they have no idea how many bodies are strewn throughout the territory. In this war specifically, because even the US administration cited that that's a made-up number, the Hamas administration then put out lists with pictures and ID numbers of, at the time the body count was 8,000, of all 8,000 people. Now, could it be that they're lying? It could. In my experience, following this conflict for many years, their numbers usually are pretty accurate. And even if in the moment they're not, they end up, forgive me for being cavalier about it, evening out. So if they exaggerated by 500, there's probably 500 bodies under the rubble. So that's in terms of why do I rely on those numbers? And I always say, it's the Palestinian Health Ministry in Gaza. Yes. Again, people can look up whatever sources they want. But there are also a lot of UN officials in the hospitals, and they're also the ones that are counting. Now, as to are the people there, are they all Hamas? Are they all innocent Palestinians? Are they all this? I don't know. The IDF cites that in this attack, 250 Hamas people were killed. I don't think the IDF has some of the best intelligence in the world, but as we can see from October 7th, it lacks at different places also. So I don't know that they know every single person's affiliation at the moment of a bombing. And at the same time, I don't know that they know every single person who was there. There's also the question, like I said before, what does it mean to be a Hamas operative? Does that mean you work in the post office because Hamas controls the post office, or are you only a fighter? I don't know, which is the reason that I don't cite of these, X were Hamas and X were not. It will be cited because the lists of names will be tallied up when the war is over. And then different intelligence reports will say how many of them were Hamas fighters versus not. But right now, I think it's impossible to know. I think either side is inflating the numbers when it comes to they're all innocent or they're all Hamas, which is why I try to stick to the numbers, which I didn't do in the Israeli case. In the Israeli case, I said 351 were soldiers and these were civilians, because there is a clear-cut division if you're a soldier or a civilian in the Israeli case. But in the Palestinian case, I think it's too complicated to try to say they were all innocent or they were all Hamas, which is why I just give the number.
So another question which I'll build on is Hamas's motivation, right, for doing this. You said that they were working on this plan for 2 years. One of the most convincing articles, and this was mentioned in the question that I saw, was that Hamas saw that somehow the Palestinian question was sort of fading away, that they were being abandoned by by what had been their Arab patrons, that the Iranians were somehow ineffective, and that this was a way of keeping the issue alive. Now, the only thing that, and this is what I'll add to that, that speaks against it, against that as an explanation, is that they were preparing it for 2 years, right? And that 2 years ago, they couldn't have known exactly this, right? It made some sense on October 7th. I mean, sense, right? There was a logic, if a murderous logic, but a logic. And so what's your take on that? What do you think they were up to? I mean, there's been some interrogations, there's been some tapes, there's been lots of, any amount of analysis, but what's your best guess?
So when this happened, as someone who, I wrote my dissertation on Hamas, when this happened, everyone asked, so were you surprised? And I said, I'm surprised they pulled it off. I'm surprised that they managed to do that. I'm not surprised at all that they wanted to do that. And I will add that the person who cited, we did this because of the Palestinian question was was off the map and we wanted to put it back on the map, was Khalil al-Khaya, who is part of Hamas's leadership abroad, who did not actually know about the plan to detail. So the fact that he is framing this as this was the reason we did it has to be taken with a bit of an asterisk, because he is now trying to say what is the reason that we want to attribute to this. However, I'll say that Hamas, in my opinion, was motivated by 3 different things. One, a genuine desire to release all Palestinian prisoners. So when the war broke out, there were some 5,500 Palestinian prisoners. Since then, that number has grown a lot because of the IDF crackdowns in the West Bank and people arrested in Gaza and the attackers that were arrested. And the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, Yahya Sinwar, himself was released from jail as a result of a hostage exchange in the Gilad Shalit deal of 2011. And when he rose to power very quickly to become the leader of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, he said, my one solemn vow is I will not forget my oath to release every Palestinian prisoner. And I think that they truly wanted to do that. And again, we can say right, wrong, if not. That was at least, I think, one of his big motivations. Now, alongside that, Palestinian prisoners are one of the most important facets in Palestinian narrative. It has been for years. The release of prisoners by any group grants you monumental prestige in the Palestinian territories among Palestinians. Again, each side always has their sore points. Each side has a specific point. Palestinian prisoners is one of the biggest points among the Palestinian population. So in addition to the genuine desire to release prisoners, I think this is associated with the other motivation, which is to raise Hamas's stature as part of a plan to take over the West Bank. Because the Palestinian Authority is completely dysfunctional. According to surveys, Hamas is losing, prior to the war, is losing popularity in the Gaza Strip and is gaining in the West Bank. Mahmoud Abbas, the chair of the Palestinian Authority, is seen as an Israeli collaborator. He's also in his mid-80s, has cancer and a chain smoker. There's a lot of reasons to think the Palestinian Authority is going to collapse. And I think Hamas was trying to elevate its position as part of that. And I'll add that again, I don't think they planned to succeed as much as they did. And I'm not sure they factored in. I think the two miscalculations they made was, as a result of this, they didn't expect Israel's retaliation to be so brutal because they didn't expect to succeed so much. And they also, I think, were very assured that Hezbollah would join also, which would make the conflict very different. But I think that was their motivation in the specific context, right? There's a larger ideology and et cetera, but like in the specific context of why to plan this for 2 years, I think it was the release of prisoners and also in anticipation, we want to bolster our position as part of a takeover of the West Bank.
Alon, I want to thank you. I didn't agree with every single thing you said. I think you actually fulfilled your promise, and that was to piss off a lot of people. And I think this will be the first of these kinds of events we hold every couple of days. In all seriousness, I wanted to thank all of you for coming out today. And For those of you who are not from UCI, I apologize. I apologize. It's not the way the students are supposed to comport themselves. Those of you who are students, congratulations. You have my respect and affection. And the Center for Jewish Studies holds a series of events. Look at our website. Right? We hold a lot of events. Some of them are on Israel. Some of them are on the Holocaust. I really want to get back to Yiddish poetry very much. It's not normal to have police presence at Yiddish poetry or Holocaust events. It's not normal that I walk across campus with police escort. That's not normal. That's not okay. And so what I would plead for, if you're students in here, tell your fellow students, we're a university. We have to comport ourselves with dignity, with respect, and we have to listen to each other. I didn't agree with everything he said. I know everybody in here didn't agree with everything he said, and that's okay. That's good. So Alon's going to stay behind, I know, because he loves mixing it up with other people. He has a cold, so stay a meter away from him. And I wanted to thank you all once again and thank Alon.
Say I get asked a lot about news sources and information. I'm not the be-all and end-all of news information, but I do put out a summary every day on what's happening in the war. It's on my YouTube channel. Feel free to go every day. I go through all of these things. What happened in the last 24 hours? Thanks for coming.